How's it going, everybody? Handsome Dan here, and at long last, we're here with episode 1 of the Grand Tournament. We wanted to get this out sooner, but unfortunately, due to delays with COVID and Hurricane Ida, we only recently just got around to recording our games. A few quick disclaimers about the format. Because of the delays in starting up, our first matches were actually recorded right around the time that Innistrad Midnight Hunt released. Our decks were locked once we started playing, but you are going to see some Innistrad cards in our decks based on whether or not we were able to pick up those singles. This also means that this event started after the Golos ban. If you watched our intro video, then you know that Golos was one of the decks that Caleb was bringing for this event. However, we had a Rule 0 discussion and agreed to allow Caleb to play this event with Golos rather than having to build a brand new deck. We want to encourage everybody to have Rule 0 discussions about power levels and game expectations to make sure that everybody comes away from a game with the best play experience they can. That's it for the announcements, but we waited long enough for episode 1, so let's go ahead and get into it. Since this is game 1, we did a blind pick before the game to see which decks each person was going to be playing, so that way we couldn't counterpick. I'll be leading off with my Sarulf deck. This deck is all about destroying my opponent's permanents to grow Sarulf as big as possible and then swing in for lethal damage. Since I'm running a lot of mass removal, I'm using my lands as a way for me to generate lasting value. I have to mull the 6 unfortunately, so my starting hand has a Command Tower, a Wasteland, Blast Zone, Colony Ambush, Vorinclex, and Scape Shift. I also have a Regrowth, which I send back as part of my mulligan. Caleb's going to be starting out with his Neyith deck. This is a Gruul Stompy deck focused around playing big creatures and fighting as much as possible to accumulate value. Caleb keeps his starting hand with 2 Snow Forests, a Nature's Claim, Bonds of Mortality, Sword of Hearth and Home, Collector Oof, and Uvenwald Tracker. Jelly's going to be playing Talrand as his first deck. The goal of this deck is to cast Talrand and then generate a bunch of Drakes as a bonus for playing cantrips, counterspells, and spot removal. Jelly also has to mulligan to 6 and opens with 2 islands, a Reliquary Tower, a Serum Visions, Brainstorm, Capsize, and Treasure Cruise, and he sends Capsize back as part of his mulligan. Last we have Derek, who's going to be playing Varina first. This is a zombie tribal deck looking to flood the board and the graveyard with zombies until he can draw into a big zombie finisher. Derek keeps a hand with Vault of Champions, Cavern of Souls, Command Tower, Mire Triton, Gleaming Overseer, Phyrexian Ghoul, and Sidisi Undead Vizier. I won the pregame die roll, so I'll be going first. Let's go ahead and jump into the gameplay. I start off by playing a Colony Territory tapped as land for turn, and then I pass. Caleb plays a Snow Forest and taps it to cast an Uvenwald Tracker. Jelly plays an island and then uses it to cast Serum Visions. He puts both cards on top and then passes. Derek's just going to play a Command Tower. Back to me, and I play a Wasteland as land for turn and pass. Caleb has another Snow Forest, and so he taps 2 and casts the Bonds of Mortality. He swings at me and draws First Blood for 1 damage. Jelly is just going to play an island and then pass. Derek plays a Vault of Champions and then casts a Mire Triton. He mills 2, gains 2 life, and then he's done after that. Moving back to my turn, I play a Command Tower, and then I cast my commander, Sarulf. Caleb plays another Snow Forest and casts a Sword of Hearth and Home. He moves to his end step, and Jelly's going to use his open mana to cast a Brainstorm. On his turn, Jelly plays out an island, and then he casts Kira, Great Glass Spinner. Derek plays a Gleaming Overseer, and then amasses to make a 1/1 zombie army. Back over to me again, where I play a Blast Zone as land for turn. It comes in with a counter on it, and then I pass. Caleb plays a Firelit Thicket, and then he equips the Sword of Hearth and Home to his Uvenwald Tracker. He swings at Jelly for 3, getting a Forest with his Sword Trigger on damage, and choosing not to blink his creature. He then plays a Wayward Swordtooth with his open mana, and then he passes. On Jelly's turn, the only thing he can do is play a Reliquary Tower and then pass. Derek hits an island, and now it's time to cast Varina. He goes to attacks, and he swings the Mire Triton at me, and the zombie army at Jelly, and the Gleaming Overseer at Caleb. Varina will trigger on the attack, and Derek draws 3 cards, discards 3, and gains 3 life. We go to damage, and with nothing else, he passes. It's the start of turn 5 now, And unfortunately I still don't have much to do, so I play a tapped Malakir Mire and then I pass. Caleb plays a Wooded Foothills and then goes to combat, swinging the Swordtooth and the Tracker at Derek for 8. Derek doesn't block, and on damage, Caleb gets another Sword Trigger. He shortcuts, cracking the Wooded Foothills to search for a Cinderglade while he's searching for a Forest from the Sword Trigger. He's also going to go ahead and blink his Swordtooth back into play, and I get a counter on Sarulf from the Wooded Foothills leaving play. In his second main phase, Caleb plays a Battle Mammoth, and then he passes. At Caleb's end step, Jelly casts a Mystical Tutor to get a Resculpt to the top of his library. On his turn, he draws the Resculpt, and then he passes. Derek now moves to his turn, and goes to attacks right away. He swings the Mire Triton at Caleb, and the Zombie Army, Gleaming Overseer, and Varina over at Jelly. Derek gets a Varina trigger, drawing 4, discarding 4, and then gaining 4 life. Before blockers, Jelly responds by casting Resculpt on Varina, and then casting a Twin Cast to copy the Resculpt and then targeting Caleb's Sword of Hearth and Home. Both Derek and Caleb will get a 4/4 Elemental as a result, and then Jelly will block the Gleaming Overseer with Akira and leave the army unblocked. In Derek's second main phase, he plays a Field of the Dead and then foretells a card before ending his turn. At his end step, I cast a Vampiric Tutor to go get a card to the top of my library, losing 2 life. On my turn, I choose not to use Sarulf's trigger on my upkeep, and then I draw, and I play the Urborg that I just tutored for as land for turn. I unfortunately have no other play, so I have to pass after that. Moving on to Caleb, he drops a Snow Forest and a Homeward Path as lands for turn, then he casts his commander, Neyith. He then moves to combat and swings the Swordtooth at me, and the Battle Mammoth at Jelly, and his Elemental at Derek. No one blocks as to not give Caleb any extra cards from Neyith's trigger. That ends Caleb's turn, so we move on to Jelly, who plays an Island, and then casts Solve the Equation. He tutors up a counterspell to his hand, and then he passes. Derek plays a Caves of Koilos as his land for turn, and then he plays a Tainted Adversary, paying the additional cost once to have it come into play with an extra counter, and making 2 zombies with Decayed. He then chooses to swing his Elemental and his Zombie Army over at Jelly, who doesn't block. At Derek's end step, I decide to go ahead and sink my mana into adding some more counters onto Blast Zone, and so I pay enough to add 2 more counters to it. Back to my turn, I still have very little to play, so I choose not to trigger Sarulf on my upkeep, and on my main phase, I cast the Daring Fiendbonder. He has to attack, so I swing it at Derek, who doesn't block, and then I pass. At my end step, Caleb chooses to use his Ulvenwald Tracker with his open mana to fight something. He chooses Sarulf to fight his Wayward Swordtooth, and Sarulf dies a sad death. On Caleb's turn, he shocks in a Stomping Ground before going to combat. He chooses to activate Neyith, targeting his Battle Mammoth to double its attack and force it to be blocked. He swings the Battle Mammoth at Jelly, his Elemental at Derek, and his Swordtooth and Neyith over to me. Jelly has to block, and Derek chooses to block with his Gleaming Overseer, which draws Caleb 2 cards, and then we go to damage. Caleb goes to his second main phase and casts the 3 visits and a Migration Path to go fetch 3 more lands. On Jelly's turn, he delves some cards and casts a Treasure Cruise to draw 3 cards. He then plays an Island, and then casts a Dreamscape Artist, and then passes. Derek plays an Isolated Chapel as his land for turn, which turns on Field of the Dead and makes him a zombie token. He then recasts Varina and then attempts to go to combat. Caleb will respond by using his Ulvenwald Tracker to fight Varina with the Wayward Swordtooth. Derek will respond to that by casting a Path to Exile on the Wayward Swordtooth, but here's where Jelly butts in and counterspells the Path to Exile. As a result, Varina will die, and Caleb gets to draw a card from the fight trigger. Now that Varina's dead, Derek has his sights set on Jelly, and he swings all out at him. He does accidentally swing with the Summoning 6 zombie, but we catch that later and fix it. Jelly will go ahead and block what he can, and drop him down to single-digit life. The decayed zombies that Derek had will also die in this process. On my turn, I draw, and then I play a much-needed Harmonize to draw 3 more cards. My Daring Fiendbinder has to attack, and so I swing it at Caleb, who doesn't block. I then play my own Field of the Dead as land for turn, making a zombie, and then passing. We move over to Caleb's turn, and Jelly has to take a second to comment on the flavor of his LaCroix.
Actually, not bad. Huh. This limoncello, not bad.
On his actual turn, Caleb goes straight to combat and activates Neyith, targeting the Battle Mammoth again. He swings the Battle Mammoth at me, Neyith and the Swordtooth at Jelly, and the Elemental at Derek. I opt to go ahead and Doomblade the Battle Mammoth here, which does draw Caleb one card. Derek blocks the Elemental, and Jelly has no blockers, so he's the only one taking damage. This puts him down to 1 life. On his second main phase, Caleb then plays even more ramp by playing a Vastwood Surge, a Beanstalk Giant, and a Search for Tomorrow. On Jelly's turn, the only thing he can do is cast Talrand and then pass. Now we go back over to Derek, who goes straight to combat as well. He's going to swing his Elemental into Zombie Army at Jelly, and his Adversary and Mire Trident at Caleb. Jelly is going to respond before blockers by casting a Rapid Hybridization on my Daring Fiendbonder, which gives me a Frog Lizard and makes himself a Drake. Jelly double blocks Derek's creatures, and Caleb does not block. On Derek's second main phase, he attempts to pay 5 life and then cast a Toxic Deluge. Jelly has other plans, however, and he decides to force a negation to board wipe. Derek instantly regrets not killing Jelly, and then he passes. Back over to my turn now, and I play a Forest as land for turn, which makes a zombie token from Field of the Dead. I then tap down some mana, and I cast Scapeshift, sacrificing my tapped lands to go get a Shizo Death Storehouse, a Golgari Rot Farm, a Cabal Coffers, and a Vesuva. I get 4 zombies from this, and I bounce my Vesuva from the Rot Farm trigger. I then cast an Arboreal Grazer, which allows me to drop the Vesuva again to make another zombie, and copy Cabal Coffers. Now I'm set up for next turn, so I go ahead and pass. On Caleb's turn, he's not having any of these Field of the Deads, and so he plays a Forest, and then casts a Gruul Rage Beast, which fights a zombie token and gets his triggers. He then has enough mana to go ahead and cast a Polyraptor. This is going to create a loop because of the Polyraptor's Enrage trigger, combined with the Gruul Rage Beast fight trigger. Caleb's going to fight the entire board, and will make Polyraptor tokens equal to the number of creatures fought, with the exception of the 0-power Arboreal Grazer. He's then going to draw 10 cards because of Neyith's triggers after the fights happen. Now with the board clear, Caleb moves to combat and decides to swing Neyith at Jelly to make sure that he dies, as well as the Swordtooth and Elemental at Derek. Before blocks, Derek will also go ahead and cast his Foretold card, which is Rise of the Dreadmarn, to make 3 zombies. But he decides not to block and he takes the damage here. In Caleb's second main phase, he plays out a Soul Ring and then a Ronas the Indomitable. Ronas will come in and fight a zombie, allowing Caleb to draw 1 more card before passing and discarding down. With Jelly dead, one problem solved, but things are still looking pretty grim. Derek, however, has a plan. He's going to open by casting a Zombie Apocalypse, which destroys all humans and returns all of the zombies in his graveyard to the battlefield. That's going to be a bunch of zombies, but of note, Derek's going to get back a Grey Merchant of Asphodel, a Wayward Servant, a Sidisi, a Gravecrawler, and a Phyrexian Ghoul. He stacks the triggers so that the Gary goes off first, draining Caleb and I for 12 each, gaining him 24 life. He then has the Wayward Servant trigger so that he drains us for an additional 9. This leaves Caleb at 3 and me at 1 life, while Derek is going to be at 51 life. However, all of these zombies from Zombie Apocalypse come in tapped, and so Derek's still staring down the barrel of a gajillion Polyraptors and some other stuff on Caleb's board. So, he has to try to find a way to win the game right now. So he triggers Sidisi's ETB effect and exploits one of his zombies, to which I spitefully respond by wastelanding his command tower. He floats a black, and then he goes to tutor from the Sidisi exploit. After some thinking, Derek grabs a card and then sacks 5 of his creatures to Phyrexian Ghoul, including Gravecrawler. He then casts the card he tutored for, which is a Songs of the Damned, making him 5 black mana. Derek's now going to go ahead and use the mana to cast his Gravecrawler from the graveyard, triggering the Wayward Servant and killing me and taking Caleb down to 2. He repeats this process again by sacrificing the Gravecrawler and recasting it, dropping Caleb down to 1. Derek still has 3 mana floating, so he's going to go for a 3rd cast of the Gravecrawler. But on this 3rd time, Caleb has a response to the cast and casts an Inscription of Abundance, choosing to gain life equal to the greatest power of creatures he controls. That gains him 6 life, which puts him at 6 after the Gravecrawler resolves. With no more tricks up his sleeve, Derek can only go ahead and use the last of his floating mana to make another zombie token. Caleb gets trained for one more, but Derek then passes. This means that Caleb has the game in the bag, and so to make sure, he casts the Beast Within on the Phyrexian Ghoul, and then uses a Titanic Brawl to restart the Polyraptor loop and wipe Derek's board for good measure. With nothing left in his way, he swings in for lethal and takes Game 1 of the Grand Tournament. This was a bit of a weird game as neither Jelly nor I ever really got much going. Caleb was left mostly unchecked for the entirety of the game, and so he was able to draw freely from his fight triggers from Neyith and develop a massive board. Derek tried to answer on multiple occasions, like using Toxic Deluge and trying to Path to Exile to save his Varina, but since Jelly's deck wasn't really firing off, Jelly took the stance of playing Spoiler and actively tried to kingmate Caleb, so that way he wouldn't have to play against that Gruul deck going forward. This is where we get to see the format come into play, and so sometimes you need to ask yourself, is it better for someone else to win, so that way you remove their deck from the pool? Or is giving up a win at all just too costly? As for me, my deck also stalled out after having to mull to 6 and not drawing any impactful cards until too late in the game. I had a couple of opportunities to interact, such as maybe tutoring for a Bojuka Bog to deal with Derek's graveyard, or using Sarulf's ability to exile things like Overwhelm Tracker and zombie tokens. But this early in the format, and without any real impactful cards in my hand to interact otherwise, my game plan was to lay low and draw as little hate as possible until I could advance my board state further. This worked out a little bit better for Derek, who ended up being 1 mana shy of being able to pull out this win. Maybe his biggest mistake was not realizing how much of a pain Jelly was going to be, as he had an opportunity to kill him earlier in the game before Jelly could counterspell all of his board wipes and his other removal. And that's going to be it for Game 1, so let's go ahead and take a look at the scoreboard for what's still left to come. Keep in mind that now that Caleb has won with his Neyith deck, that means he can no longer use it for the rest of the tournament. Let us know in the comments how you think the rest of this tournament's going to go, and stay tuned for Episode 2. Thanks again for watching, everybody.